The conference room is quiet, except for the rustle of paper and the distant hum of slot machines bleeding through the walls. It's December 22nd, 1974, and the Dunes Hotel on the Las Vegas Strip holds a secret that will eventually bring down an empire spanning 4 American cities. In Room C, 3rd floor, a 32-year-old man named Allen Robert Glick is about to sign documents that will transform him into both a millionaire and a pawn in the most elaborate financial crime the American Mafia has ever attempted. His pen hovers over the signature line of a loan agreement for $62.75 million, money that doesn't come from a bank but from the pension fund of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, a union whose retirement accounts have been quietly controlled by organized crime for nearly 2 decades. Across the table sits Alan Dorfman, a man who holds no official union position yet commands complete authority over hundreds of millions in worker pensions. Dorfman's presence is calm, almost paternal, as he watches Glick review the terms. Next to him, Frank Rosenthal leans back in his chair with the easy confidence of someone who has spent his entire adult life calculating odds and exploiting them. Rosenthal is 45 years old, brilliant with numbers, barred from holding a Nevada gaming license due to a criminal record that stretches back to attempted bribery of college basketball players. Yet, he will run the casinos that Glick is about to purchase. The loan will allow Glick to acquire 2 properties: the Stardust, a sprawling resort with 1,500 rooms and the busiest casino floor in Nevada, and the Fremont, a smaller but profitable downtown establishment with loyal clientele and steady cash flow. Together, they represent a gambling empire worth far more than the loan amount, and on paper, this transaction looks like the realization of the American dream, a young veteran and lawyer parlaying ambition and opportunity into Las Vegas royalty. But nothing in this room is what it appears to be. Glick understands, or believes he understands, what this arrangement entails. The Teamsters' money comes with invisible strings attached to 4 mafia families in Chicago, Kansas City, Milwaukee, and Cleveland. He will hold the gaming licenses because his background is clean, his military service distinguished, his law degree legitimate. Nevada regulators will see a respectable businessman. But the actual control, the daily operations, the flow of money, all of it will belong to men like Rosenthal and the bosses he represents. Glick will be the face, others will be the hands. This division of power seems manageable to him today, even clever. He gets access to capital no legitimate bank would provide. The families get cover for an operation they cannot own openly. Everyone profits. What Glick cannot foresee, what no one in this room can imagine as the pen touches paper and ink flows across the signature line, is that within 5 years, federal agents will present him with an impossible choice: decades in prison or life in witness protection, and that his decision will detonate a prosecutorial bomb that destroys not just this operation, but 4 entire crime families simultaneously. The testimony of one man, a frontman, will accomplish what decades of FBI investigations could never achieve. But that reckoning is still years away. For now, Glick signs. Hands are shaken, smiles are exchanged, and the machine begins to turn. Allen Glick was born in Pittsburgh in 1942 to a middle-class Jewish family that gave him stability, education, and conventional expectations. His childhood was unremarkable in the way that most American childhoods were unremarkable in the 1950s: public schools, decent grades, a path toward college, and respectability. He was bright enough to attend Ohio State University, disciplined enough to graduate with a business degree in 1964, and patriotic, or perhaps ambitious enough, to join the Army as the Vietnam War began to consume the country. He served as an officer, earned a Bronze Star for his service in Vietnam, and returned home in 1967 with the kind of credential that opened doors. He enrolled at Case Western Reserve University's law school in Cleveland, passed the bar in 1970, and began practicing law. But law practice bored him. The hourly billing, the cautious advice, the modest income, all of it felt like a trap. Glick wanted more than competence could provide. He wanted wealth. the kind that came not from decades of careful accumulation, but from bold moves and calculated risks. So in 1971, he moved to San Diego and entered real estate development, building apartment complexes and small commercial properties financed through conventional loans. He was good at it, good enough to establish relationships with lenders and contractors, good enough to generate steady returns. But steady wasn't enough. He watched other developers, men with access to unconventional capital, build empires while he built buildings. Someone, and accounts differ on exactly who, suggested he approach Allen Dorfman about financing through the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund. Dorfman was the key that unlocked everything. Born in 1923 in Detroit, he was the stepson of Paul Dorfman, a labor racketeer with deep connections to the Chicago outfit. Allen inherited those connections and used them to build an insurance empire that served as the gateway to the Teamsters Pension Fund. He wasn't a union official, had no formal role in fund management, but he controlled who received loans and under what terms. The fund had billions in assets and a lending philosophy that confused legitimate bankers. Projects that conventional lenders rejected due to poor financials or questionable business plans received millions from the Teamsters. Las Vegas casino loans were a specialty. The fund had financed numerous properties, including Caesar's Palace and the Aladdin, under terms that barely qualified as loans: low interest, flexible repayment, minimal oversight. The Mafia used the fund as their private bank, borrowing money to build casinos they controlled through frontmen, then skimming profits before reporting them as taxable revenue. Glick approached Dorfman in 1973 with a modest proposal, a real estate project in San Diego requiring $1.2 million. Dorfman approved the loan with terms so favorable they should have raised questions. Glick completed the project, repaid the loan, and established himself as reliable. What he didn't fully grasp was that this small transaction was an audition. Dorfman and his associates were evaluating whether Glick possessed the qualities they needed in a frontman: clean record, legitimate credentials, manageable ambition, and enough moral flexibility to ignore what would be happening around him. By mid-1974, Dorfman was ready to use him for something much larger. The Stardust and Fremont casinos were available, and mob families needed someone to hold the licenses while they controlled the operations. Glick fit perfectly. He was young, educated, a decorated veteran with no criminal history, no obvious mob connections, exactly the profile that Nevada gaming regulators would approve. The negotiations moved quickly through the fall of 1974. Glick would purchase both casinos for approximately $75 million, financed by the massive Teamsters loan. His personal investment would be minimal, just a few million borrowed from other sources. In exchange for this extraordinary financing, he would allow Frank Rosenthal to manage the properties and would cooperate with arrangements for distributing unreported casino profits to bosses in 4 cities. When the Nevada Gaming Control Board reviewed Glick's application in late 1974 and early 75, investigators saw exactly what they were supposed to see: military service, law degree, business experience, financial backing from a legitimate pension fund. They interviewed him extensively. Glick presented himself as an ambitious young businessman entering Nevada's most prestigious industry. The investigators found nothing disqualifying and approved his gaming license in March of 1975. Allen Glick became the licensed owner of 2 major Las Vegas casinos. Publicly, he was an entrepreneur. Privately, he was a shell concealing the most sophisticated organized crime operation the city had ever seen. Frank Rosenthal was nothing like Allen Glick. Born in Chicago in June of 1929 into a middle-class Jewish family on the West Side, Rosenthal discovered early that his mind worked differently than other people's. While classmates struggled with basic arithmetic, he calculated complex probabilities in his head. By 12, he was handicapping horse races with disturbing accuracy. By 15, he was placing bets through older contacts and winning far more often than chance allowed. School became irrelevant. He dropped out before graduating and began working full-time as a professional gambler and handicapper, earning money through pure analytical skill rather than conventional employment. His talent was extraordinary.
He didn't just understand odds, he could see inefficiencies in how bookmakers set lines and exploit them systematically. He used statistical analysis decades before computers made such work routine. Sportsbooks feared him because he won too consistently, too methodically. They limited his bet sizes because they recognized he possessed advantages they couldn't overcome. But Rosenthal's genius had a criminal edge. He was willing to fix games, bribing athletes to manipulate point spreads. In 1961, he was arrested in connection with an attempt to bribe University of North Carolina basketball players to shave points, winning games by margins smaller than the betting spread, so gamblers betting the underdog would profit. The case collapsed when witnesses refused to testify, but the arrest created a permanent criminal record that would bar him from ever legally holding a Nevada gaming license. That barrier became the defining constraint of his career, a ceiling he would spend decades trying to circumvent. Despite the arrest, Rosenthal's reputation grew throughout the 1960s. The Chicago outfit, recognizing his value, brought him into their orbit. He wasn't a made member, wasn't inducted into La Cosa Nostra, but he became a trusted associate running illegal sports betting operations that required sophisticated odds calculation and risk management. He formed a close friendship with Anthony Spilatro, a vicious outfit enforcer who handled problems through violence and intimidation. The two men were opposites. Rosenthal, brilliant and analytical, Spilatro, brutal and impulsive. But their partnership would eventually extend to Las Vegas with catastrophic results. In the late 60s, Rosenthal moved to Florida, managing sports betting for outfit-connected bookmakers, then relocated to Las Vegas in 1968. The Stardust hired him under vague titles: entertainment consultant, food and beverage director, positions that had nothing to do with his actual work advising on sportsbook operations. His criminal record prevented formal employment in gaming, but Nevada regulators struggled to prove he was operating without a license. Under his guidance, the Stardust Sportsbook became the most profitable in the city. He introduced innovations in odds setting, risk management, and customer service that revolutionized sports betting. He demonstrated that despite lacking formal authority, he could manage a major casino operation better than licensed professionals. By 1974, when Allen Dorfman and mob bosses needed someone to actually run the casinos that Glick would own on paper, Rosenthal was the inevitable choice. He had the expertise, the track record, and the trust of outfit figures who controlled the operation. The arrangement was elegant in its simplicity. Glick would hold the licenses, Rosenthal would run the casinos, the bosses would receive the profits. Rosenthal would finally achieve what his criminal record had denied him: effective control of major Las Vegas properties. And for a few years it would work brilliantly, until the invisible empire they built became too visible to ignore. Frank Balistrieri was born in Milwaukee in May of 1918 to Sicilian immigrants who operated a small grocery store on the city's impoverished South Side. He grew up in an era when organized crime offered Italian immigrants one of the few paths to prosperity in a society that systematically excluded them from mainstream economic opportunities. But Balistrieri wasn't a typical gangster. He was intelligent, educated, strategic. He attended the University of Wisconsin, then Marquette Law School, graduating in 1941 and passing the bar examination. He could have pursued a legitimate legal career, representing clients in courtrooms, building a respectable practice. Instead, he became a mob lawyer and eventually a mob boss, providing legal services to Milwaukee's Italian criminals while gradually becoming involved in the very activities he was defending. Milwaukee's mafia family was small, perhaps 50 made members and a few hundred associates, controlling gambling, loan sharking, and vending machines throughout Wisconsin. The family operated essentially as a satellite of the Chicago outfit, paying tribute and operating with Chicago's permission. Balistrieri rose through this modest organization through intelligence rather than violence. There are no credible accounts of him personally committing murders, though he certainly ordered them through subordinates. He operated nightclubs, vending machine companies, and illegal gambling operations while maintaining the veneer of legitimacy through his law degree and involvement in legitimate businesses. In 1961, Joseph Bonanno, the powerful New York boss, visited Milwaukee and presided over Balistrieri's formal induction into La Cosa Nostra. The ceremony was unusual. Typically, bosses inducted members into their own families. But Milwaukee apparently lacked sufficient leadership to conduct its own initiations and required assistance from a visiting dignitary. Shortly after his induction, Balistrieri became boss of Milwaukee's family, assuming control of an organization that would never rival Chicago or New York, but could generate substantial income through careful management of regional rackets. His tenure was characterized by diversification and expansion into legitimate businesses, always with the goal of increasing revenue streams and reducing dependence on traditional street crimes that attracted police attention. When the opportunity arose in 1974 to invest in the Las Vegas Skim operation through Allen Glick's casino acquisition, Balistrieri enthusiastically participated. Milwaukee's share was negotiated with the other families, roughly 15 to 20% of Skim proceeds, smaller than Kansas City or Chicago, but substantial enough to generate hundreds of thousands in annual unreported cash. Balistrieri's role was to receive and distribute Milwaukee's portion, ensure subordinates remained disciplined and loyal, and participate in negotiations when disputes arose about percentages or procedures. He traveled occasionally to Las Vegas, meeting with Rosenthal and Glick, reminding them through his presence that powerful men were watching and mistakes would not be tolerated. But Balistrieri made a critical miscalculation about Allen Glick. He viewed him as a front man who would remain compliant through a combination of financial incentives and intimidation. He didn't recognize that Glick, unlike Maid members, bound by blood oaths and lifelong loyalty, had entered this arrangement voluntarily and could exit it through cooperation with federal authorities if the risks became unacceptable. This failure to understand the fundamental difference between an associate motivated by opportunity and a Maid member bound by omerta would eventually destroy not just the Skim operation, but Balistrieri, his sons, and the Milwaukee family entirely. The Stardust and Fremont officially transferred to Allen Glick's control in May of 1975. Argent Corporation, Glick's company, assumed ownership and gaming licenses were transferred under the watchful eyes of Nevada regulators, who saw exactly what the operation wanted them to see: a legitimate change in casino ownership driven by standard business considerations. Privately, the transfer marked the beginning of systematic theft on a scale Las Vegas had never witnessed. Frank Rosenthal immediately assumed effective control despite his official title of entertainment director, a designation that nominally had nothing to do with casino operations but allowed him to maintain an office and make daily decisions about the properties. He arrived each morning, reviewed overnight gaming revenues with pit bosses and shift managers, adjusted table limits and complimentary benefits for high-value customers, and applied his analytical expertise to maximize profits. Under his management, the Stardust transformed. He adjusted table game rules to marginally increase house advantages without making games so unfavorable that customers fled to competitors. He reorganized the casino floor to encourage extended play through strategic placement of games and machines. He improved customer service, understanding that repeat visitors generated more revenue than one-time tourists. The sportsbook, already successful, became the most sophisticated betting operation in Nevada under his guidance, offering more games, better odds, and faster payouts than any competitor. The Stardust's reported gaming revenues climbed from roughly $60 million annually in 1974 to over $100 million by 1977. Gaming regulators viewed this success as validation that Allen Glick was an effective owner and the property was exceptionally well managed. What they couldn't see was the skim. The mechanics were sophisticated yet conceptually simple. Every day after table games closed and slot machines were emptied, casino employees transported all cash to the count room, a secure area where money was officially tallied before being recorded as gross gaming revenue. In legitimate casinos, this counting occurred under strict supervision with multiple employees and managers present, totals recorded and verified through redundant procedures designed to prevent theft or error. But at the Stardust and Fremont under mob control, the count room process was corrupted from the beginning. Before official counting started, trusted employees removed predetermined amounts of cash, typically between $40,000 and $100,000 daily at the Stardust, and smaller amounts at the Fremont. This removed cash was placed in separate containers, locked away, and set aside. Only the remaining money was counted and recorded as the casino's official revenue. The skimmed cash never appeared on any document, never passed through any official channel, simply vanished from the financial record as if it had never existed. The removed cash was then transported from Las Vegas to the four cities by couriers, mob associates who made regular trips carrying briefcases and luggage containing hundreds of thousands of dollars in untraceable bills. These couriers traveled on commercial airlines, drove rental cars, stayed in hotels that accepted cash payments. They dressed in business attire, carried ordinary-looking luggage, and maintained schedules designed to avoid patterns that might attract law enforcement attention. In Kansas City, Chicago, Milwaukee, and Cleveland, family representatives received the cash, counted and verified it against expected amounts based on detailed records showing each family's negotiated percentage. Kansas City received approximately 40% of skim proceeds, reflecting Nick Savella's crucial role in facilitating the original Teamsters loan and his family's dominance across the Midwest. Chicago took roughly 30%, a reflection of the outfit's power and influence. Milwaukee received between 15 and 20%. Cleveland got 10 to 15%. By 1976, the total annual skim from both casinos exceeded $2 million. By 1978, it approached $3 million.
This was pure profit, untaxed and unreported cash that bosses used to fund their operations, enrich themselves personally, and maintain their power structures. The money allowed these families to operate, to pay soldiers and associates, to bribe officials, to finance new criminal ventures, to sustain themselves as viable organizations. But the skim's sophistication contained inherent vulnerabilities that would eventually prove fatal. It required coordination among multiple families, necessitating regular communication between bosses who discussed revenues, percentages, and courier schedules over phones that might be wiretapped. It required trusting professionals like Glick and Rosenthal who were not bound by omerta and might cooperate if prosecuted. Most critically, it required maintaining absolute control over Allen Glick, who held the gaming licenses and possessed the knowledge to destroy the entire operation with a few days of testimony. The machine generated millions, but it was built on a foundation that could crack the moment sufficient pressure was applied to its weakest component. The FBI's investigation began not with dramatic discoveries, but with routine financial analysis. In early 1976, agents in the Las Vegas field office reviewed Nevada Gaming Control Board reports documenting casino revenues and noticed anomalies in Argent Corporation's properties. Revenues seemed lower than the casino's size and traffic would suggest. Financial patterns were inconsistent with comparable properties. Unexplained variations appeared in reported earnings quarter to quarter. These anomalies didn't prove skimming, but they justified further investigation, and the Bureau began what would become one of the most extensive surveillance operations in its history.
FBI agents spent thousands of hours in unmarked cars outside the Stardust and Fremont, photographing individuals entering and leaving, documenting relationships between casino employees and known organized crime figures, following suspected couriers as they traveled from Las Vegas to Midwest cities. They recorded license plates, tracked movements, identified patterns. They photographed Frank Rosenthal entering the Stardust each morning despite lacking any official gaming license. They documented meetings between Allen Glick and individuals later identified as mob associates. They followed men who appeared to be transporting something valuable, noting their routes from Las Vegas to Kansas City, Chicago, Milwaukee, and Cleveland with clockwork regularity. Simultaneously, FBI offices in those Midwest cities conducted parallel investigations, installing wiretaps on phones used by known mobsters and recording conversations that sometimes referenced Las Vegas casino revenues and cash distributions. The conversations were usually oblique. Mob figures understood phones might be monitored and used coded language, referring to the gold mine, the store, or our investment rather than naming casinos explicitly. But patterns emerged. Bosses discussed revenues in ways that clearly referenced the Stardust. They complained when shipments were delayed or reduced. They argued about percentages and distributions. In Kansas City, FBI agents recorded conversations between Nick Savella and his associates that explicitly referenced Las Vegas operations. Savella was cautious but not sufficiently paranoid. He discussed revenues from the store, identified through context as the Stardust, and complained that amounts received weren't meeting expectations. He mentioned specific dollar figures that matched what surveillance suggested were skim proceeds. These wiretap recordings, combined with surveillance documentation and financial analysis, created a comprehensive picture of a systematic criminal operation involving 4 families coordinating to steal casino revenues. But evidence sufficient for indictment remained elusive. Prosecutors needed witnesses who could testify about the skim's mechanics, how money was removed from count rooms, how couriers operated, how distributions occurred. They needed documents proving unreported revenue existed and where it flowed. Most importantly, they needed Allen Glick or Frank Rosenthal to cooperate. Both men possessed detailed knowledge of the operation and could testify about mob control of Argent casinos. But convincing either to betray their mob partners required applying pressure that overcame both fear of retaliation and financial incentives to remain silent. The FBI began building criminal cases against both men, gathering evidence of their roles in the skim operation, preparing indictments that would force them to choose between lengthy prison sentences and cooperation with federal authorities. By 1977, tensions were developing within the operation itself. The smooth coordination that characterized the first 2 years was eroding due to disputes about money, concerns about law enforcement scrutiny, and personality conflicts between powerful men unaccustomed to compromise. The first major conflict involved Frank Rosenthal's increasing public profile. Despite lacking a gaming license, Rosenthal became a celebrity in Las Vegas, hosting a weekly television show filmed at the Stardust featuring interviews with athletes and entertainers. The Frank Rosenthal Show aired locally and made his face familiar to thousands of residents. He appeared in newspaper articles discussing sports betting and casino management. He was photographed at high-profile events with his wife Jiri, a former showgirl whose beauty and extravagant lifestyle attracted constant media attention. This visibility deeply concerned mob bosses. The entire skim operation depended on maintaining low profiles, avoiding attention that might trigger regulatory scrutiny or federal investigation. Rosenthal's television show and media appearances directly contradicted this fundamental principle. Chicago and Kansas City bosses sent messages through intermediaries. Rosenthal needed to reduce his public profile, stop drawing attention, remember that he was an employee, not a celebrity. Rosenthal resisted. He enjoyed the attention, believed his television show enhanced the Stardust's reputation, and resented being told what to do by men who didn't understand casino operations as well as he did. This resistance created dangerous friction. The bosses weren't accustomed to employees refusing orders. Rosenthal wasn't accustomed to being treated as a subordinate. Disputes arose about skim amounts. Frank Balistreri believed Milwaukee was receiving insufficient percentages relative to his family's role in facilitating Teamsters loans. He demanded an increased share, arguing that Milwaukee deserved more than the 15 to 20% currently allocated. Kansas City and Chicago refused, insisting that percentages accurately reflected each family's contributions and relative power within the national organization. The dispute simmered throughout 1977, creating resentment and mutual suspicion that undermined the cooperation the operation required. More seriously, concerns grew about Allen Glick's reliability. Glick had become increasingly uncomfortable with his role as frontman. He observed daily that Frank Rosenthal made decisions about properties Glick nominally owned. He received orders from mob associates about hirings, firings, and operational changes. He recognized that despite holding gaming licenses, he wasn't truly in control. Glick also faced mounting financial pressures. The Teamsters loan required regular payments, and casino operations, while profitable, generated less cash for him personally than anticipated because so much revenue was skimmed before he saw it. He had borrowed money to make his initial investment and owed creditors demanding repayment. His financial situation was precarious despite ostensibly owning casinos worth tens of millions of dollars. In early 1978, Glick attempted to assert control over his own properties. He issued directives about casino operations without consulting Rosenthal. He hired executives without mob approval. He began making decisions as if he actually owned the casinos rather than simply holding licenses for the mob's benefit. This assertion of independence enraged the bosses. Frank Balistrieri, representing Milwaukee's interests, traveled to Las Vegas to meet with Glick in March of 1978. The confrontation occurred at the Stardust in Glick's office. Balistrieri was direct and threatening. Glick would later testify about this meeting before federal grand juries, describing how Balistrieri made absolutely clear that Glick's role was to hold licenses and cooperate, not to make independent decisions. According to Glick's testimony, Balistrieri used language that could only be interpreted as threats against his physical safety and potentially that of his family if he continued asserting independence. This confrontation became the turning point. Glick realized he wasn't a businessman operating in partnership with investors, but rather a frontman controlled by criminals who would use violence if necessary to maintain compliance. He began considering his options. He could continue cooperating, accepting his subordinate role and hoping the operation would eventually end profitably. Or he could seek assistance from federal authorities, cooperating against the mob in exchange for protection and leniency. The choice would determine not only his fate, but the survival of 4 entire crime families. Throughout 1978 and 1979, the FBI intensified pressure on both Allen Glick and Frank Rosenthal. Agents subpoenaed financial records related to Argent Corporation, requesting documents about casino revenues, loan repayments, and operational expenses. They interviewed Argent employees, asking detailed questions about count room procedures and casino management hierarchies. They made their investigation deliberately visible, ensuring that Glick and Rosenthal understood they were under serious federal scrutiny. Prosecutors in Las Vegas and Kansas City prepared indictments based on evidence accumulated over years. They had surveillance documenting suspicious cash movements, wiretaps recording conversations about Las Vegas revenues, financial analysis showing Argent casinos reported revenues inconsistent with their size and traffic. But they needed witnesses who could testify about the operation's internal mechanics, explain how the skim actually functioned day to day, and identify the bosses receiving stolen money. In September of 1978, FBI agents approached Allen Glick directly. They informed them that federal grand juries were investigating Argent Corporation, that indictments were likely, and that he personally faced prosecution for fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. They emphasized that evidence against him was substantial: financial records, surveillance, witness testimony from Argent employees who had already begun cooperating. But the agents also offered an alternative: full cooperation. If Glick agreed to testify about mob control of Argent casinos, about the skim operations mechanics, about his interactions with Balistrieri and other mob figures, prosecutors would offer a plea agreement with dramatically reduced charges and leniency in sentencing. He could avoid decades in federal prison. He could enter witness protection if necessary, receiving a new identity and relocation to protect him from mob retaliation. Glick didn't immediately agree. He spent weeks consulting attorneys, weighing options, considering consequences with the kind of careful analysis that had characterized his business career. Cooperation meant testifying against powerful criminals who would certainly want him dead.
It meant admitting to crimes, to being a willing frontman, to participating knowingly in a massive conspiracy.
It meant destroying his reputation and possibly his ability to ever work in legitimate business again. But refusing to cooperate meant almost certain conviction and lengthy imprisonment. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. Glick held the gaming licenses, signed the financial statements, was the visible owner of casinos engaged in systematic theft. Prosecutors could prove his involvement regardless of whether he was enthusiastic or reluctant, willing or coerced. A jury would convict him based purely on documentary evidence. Moreover, Glick was genuinely afraid. Frank Balistrieri's threats in March of 1978 had convinced him that mob associates would use violence if he became a liability. If he was indicted and prosecutors believed he might cooperate, the mob might decide to eliminate him preemptively before he could testify. Cooperation with witness protection offered genuine safety that remaining silent could never guarantee. In January of 1979, Allen Glick made his decision. He contacted federal prosecutors and agreed to cooperate fully. He would testify about everything: the Teamsters loan arrangement, the deal with Dorfman, Frank Rosenthal's actual role managing casinos despite lacking a license, Frank Balistrieri's explicit threats, the skim operation's detailed mechanics. In exchange, prosecutors offered a plea agreement where Glick would plead guilty to reduced charges of conspiracy and filing false financial statements, receiving a sentence of probation rather than prison time. He entered the federal witness protection program temporarily while preparing to testify, though he would eventually leave protection and resume using his real name.
Glick's cooperation was absolutely devastating to the skim operation and the families behind it. He provided prosecutors with extraordinarily detailed testimony about how Argent was created explicitly as a front for mob control, how gaming licenses were obtained through deliberate deception of Nevada regulators, how Rosenthal operated without a license under various fictitious titles, how Balistrieri and other mob figures exerted control through explicit threats and intimidation. Most importantly, he testified that the skim existed as a systematic operation, that unreported cash was removed from count rooms before official tallying, that this theft generated millions of dollars annually distributed to mob families in 4 cities according to predetermined percentages. His testimony, combined with years of FBI surveillance, wiretap recordings, and financial analysis, provided prosecutors with sufficient evidence to indict dozens of defendants on racketeering charges under RICO statutes. Based on Allen Glick's cooperation and the massive volume of evidence gathered through years of patient investigation, federal prosecutors began preparing comprehensive RICO indictments against mob figures involved in the skim operation. RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, enacted in 1970, allowed prosecutors to charge entire criminal enterprises rather than isolated individual crimes. If prosecutors could prove that an organization existed for criminal purposes and that defendants were members or associates, they could seek dramatically enhanced sentences and extensive asset forfeiture. The casino skim cases were ideal RICO prosecutions. Glick testified that 4 families had coordinated the skim operation systematically, that bosses from each family had negotiated percentages and resolved disputes through regular communication, that couriers transported cash according to schedules established by mob leadership. Wiretap recordings corroborated his testimony perfectly, capturing conversations about Las Vegas revenues and cash distributions. Financial analysis demonstrated conclusively that Argent casinos reported revenues wildly inconsistent with their actual earnings, strongly suggesting systematic and sophisticated underreporting. On October 13, 1981, federal grand juries in Kansas City and Las Vegas simultaneously returned indictments against multiple defendants in a coordinated action designed to prevent any family from warning others or destroying evidence. The indictments charged leaders and associates of 4 families with racketeering, interstate transportation of stolen property, and conspiracy to defraud the United States through systematic tax evasion.
Kansas City defendants included Nick Savella, the boss who died before trial in March of 1983, his brother Carl Savella serving as underboss, Carl DeLuna, a feared enforcer, and several associates directly involved in receiving skim proceeds and coordinating courier operations. Chicago defendants included Joseph Ayupa, the boss, John Cerrone, the underboss, Joseph Lombardo, a powerful capo, and Angelo LaPietra, another influential capo, all charged with receiving skim proceeds and operating an illegal racketeering enterprise. Alan Dorfman, the Teamsters insurance executive who had facilitated the original loan that made everything possible, was also indicted separately.
Milwaukee defendants included Frank Balistrieri as boss, his sons Joseph and John Balistrieri, and several close associates. Frank Balistrieri faced charges of racketeering, receiving skim proceeds, and using interstate commerce to threaten Allen Glick in the March 1978 confrontation. Cleveland defendants included James Lecavoli, known as Blackie, serving as boss, Angelo Leonardo, the underboss, and multiple associates, all charged with receiving skim proceeds and participating in a criminal enterprise spanning multiple states. The indictments were unprecedented in their coordination and scope. Federal prosecutors in Kansas City, Las Vegas, Chicago, Milwaukee, and Cleveland had worked together for months, sharing evidence across jurisdictions, coordinating charges to ensure legal consistency, making certain that defendants from all four families were indicted simultaneously on the same day. This extraordinary coordination prevented any family from escaping prosecution or warning others about imminent arrests. The entire leadership structure of four major mafia families was indicted in a single coordinated action, all charged with participating in the same massive criminal conspiracy. The indictments also charged numerous individuals directly involved in skim operations at the casinos themselves. Count room supervisors who had physically removed cash before official counts, couriers who had transported money to Midwest cities, casino executives who had facilitated the fraud through their positions of trust. These lower-level defendants faced enormous pressure to cooperate and provide additional testimony that would strengthen cases against the bosses. Frank Rosenthal was named as an unindicted co-conspirator. Prosecutors possessed extensive evidence of his central role managing Argent casinos without any legal authority and directly overseeing skim operations. However, they strategically decided not to indict him, calculating that his potential testimony would be valuable if he could be persuaded to cooperate. Rosenthal refused absolutely to cooperate, invoking his Fifth Amendment rights when subpoenaed before grand juries. But without formal charges against him, he couldn't be compelled to testify at trial, and prosecutors determined they had sufficient evidence from Glick and other cooperating witnesses that Rosenthal's testimony wasn't essential for convictions. Alan Dorfman was indicted separately in Chicago for conspiracy and fraud related to the massive Teamsters loan that had initiated the entire operation. Dorfman faced trial in early 1983, but on January 20, 1983, while the case was actively proceeding, Dorfman was murdered in a hotel parking lot in Lincolnwood, Illinois. He was shot multiple times at close range by unknown gunmen who fled immediately. The murder was never officially solved, but law enforcement universally believed it was ordered by mob bosses who feared Dorfman might cooperate to avoid conviction and lengthy imprisonment. His death eliminated what could have been a crucial witness, but by that point, prosecutors had Glick's comprehensive testimony and such extensive physical evidence that Dorfman's potential cooperation was no longer essential. The trials began in 1982 and continued through 1984 in a series of complex proceedings that attracted enormous media attention. Multiple trials occurred simultaneously in different jurisdictions as defendants from each city were prosecuted. Reporters filled courtrooms daily. Newspapers published extensive coverage. Television news broadcasts featured regular updates about the conviction of major mob figures in what was being called the most significant organized crime prosecution in American history. The Kansas City trial began in September of 1983 in federal court with Carl Savella and Carl DeLuna as primary defendants, along with several associates. Allen Glick was the prosecution's star witness, testifying for days about the Teamsters loan, the arrangement that made him a frontman, Frank Rosenthal's actual role managing casino operations, and the Skim's detailed mechanics. Defense attorneys attacked Glick viciously and relentlessly. They emphasized repeatedly that he was a confessed criminal testifying specifically to avoid prison, that he had every conceivable incentive to lie and please prosecutors, that he was complicit in the very crimes he now self-righteously condemned. They suggested he was fabricating mob involvement to shift blame from his own incompetent management. They highlighted inconsistencies between his various statements to FBI agents and grand jury testimony over multiple years. But Glick's testimony was corroborated by overwhelming independent evidence. Wiretap recordings captured Nick Savella discussing Las Vegas revenues in terminology that perfectly matched Glick's description of the skim operation. Surveillance photographs documented numerous meetings between Glick and identified mob figures. Financial analysis of Argent Corporation's official records revealed unmistakable patterns consistent with systematic underreporting of revenues. Former Argent employees testified about count room procedures that deliberately allowed cash to be removed before any official recording occurred. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning guilty verdicts on multiple counts. Carl Savella was convicted of racketeering, conspiracy, and interstate transportation of stolen property, sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. Carl DeLuna received 25 years. Other Kansas City defendants received sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years, effectively destroying the Kansas City family's leadership structure. The Chicago trial began in December of 1985 in federal court, with Joseph Aiuppa, John Cerrone, and Joseph Lombardo as primary defendants. Again, Allen Glick testified extensively and in extraordinary detail. He described meetings with Chicago representatives, explicit threats he had received when attempting to assert control over his own casinos, and the sophisticated distribution system that sent skim proceeds to Chicago on a regular schedule. The evidence was similarly and overwhelmingly convincing. Wiretaps recorded Chicago bosses discussing the gold mine in Las Vegas, complaining bitterly about reduced revenues, and instructing subordinates about courier schedules with unmistakable specificity. Surveillance documented cash deliveries to locations directly controlled by the Chicago outfit. Financial analysis proved definitively that Argent casinos generated far more actual revenue than official records ever indicated. Joseph Aiuppa was convicted on January 21, 1986, of racketeering and conspiracy, sentenced to 28 years in federal prison. John Cerrone received an identical 28-year sentence. Joseph Lombardo received 15 years. The sentences effectively and permanently ended these men's criminal careers. Aiuppa was 78 years old at sentencing. Cerrone was 77. Lombardo was 56. None would ever be released to resume their former positions. Aiuppa died in prison in February of 1997. Cerrone died in prison in July of 1996. Their decades of power concluded in prison cells far from Chicago. The Milwaukee trial began in 1984 in federal court with Frank Balistrieri and his sons Joseph and John as defendants. Glick's testimony was particularly damaging in this proceeding because he described in meticulous detail the March 1978 meeting where Frank Balistrieri had explicitly threatened him. Glick testified that Balistrieri had said words to the effect of, "You need to understand clearly that you don't really own these casinos. You work for us. And if you forget that fundamental fact, there will be serious consequences. Not just for you personally, but for your family." Defense attorneys argued strenuously that Glick had misinterpreted what was merely a legitimate, if forceful, business discussion, that Balistrieri was simply emphasizing the critical importance of cooperation and coordination, that no actual threats had occurred or been intended. But Glick's testimony was credible, consistent, and supported by other evidence, comprehensively demonstrating mob control of Argent Corporation through intimidation and coercion.
Frank Balistrieri was convicted on March 28, 1984, of racketeering, conspiracy, and interstate transportation of stolen property.
He was sentenced to 13 years in federal prison and fined $50,000, a sum that meant nothing compared to the millions he had received through the skim. His sons, Joseph and John, were convicted on similar charges and received sentences of 8 and 6 years respectively. The Milwaukee family, already the weakest and smallest of the 4 involved families, was utterly and completely destroyed. Frank Balistrieri was released from federal prison in 1991 due to severely declining health and died on February 7, 1993, at age 74, having never recovered even a fraction of his former power or influence in Milwaukee or anywhere else. The Cleveland trial proceeded along similar lines. James Licavoli and Angelo Leonardo were convicted in 1982. Licavoli received 17 years. But Leonardo, facing a lengthy sentence as a repeat offender with substantial prior convictions, made the extraordinary decision to cooperate with federal authorities. He became the highest-ranking mafia member to that point in American history to break omerta completely and testify against his own organization. His testimony in subsequent trials provided prosecutors with unprecedented and invaluable detail about La Cosa Nostra's internal structure, secret rituals, and criminal operations not just in Cleveland but nationally. By the end of 1986, virtually every major defendant in the casino skim cases had been convicted and sentenced to substantial federal prison terms. The bosses and underbosses of 4 mafia families were serving lengthy sentences in federal custody. The skim operation was permanently and irrevocably ended. Nevada gaming regulators had implemented dramatically stricter oversight procedures that made future large-scale skimming virtually impossible. The mob's control of Las Vegas, which had seemed unbreakable and permanent throughout the 1970s, had been comprehensively shattered. Allen Glick's cooperation with federal authorities made him one of the most significant mob informants in American history. Yet he remains relatively unknown compared to figures like Sammy Gravano or Henry Hill. This obscurity is partly by deliberate design. Glick was never a mobster who turned informant, but rather a frontman who testified about being controlled and threatened by actual mob figures. His testimony was absolutely crucial to the prosecutions, but less sensationally dramatic than accounts of murders and violent crimes that dominate popular culture. After testifying in multiple trials between 1982 and 1986, Glick served no prison time whatsoever due to his extensive cooperation. His plea agreement resulted only in probation. He left the Federal Witness Protection Program in the late 1980s, resuming use of his real name and attempting to rebuild his disrupted life. Unlike many witnesses who must remain permanently hidden under assumed identities, Glick concluded rationally that the mob figures who most wanted him dead were imprisoned or deceased, that the families he had testified against were too organizationally weak to pursue vengeance effectively, and that he could live openly without unacceptable risk. He moved to San Diego and methodically re-entered the real estate business under his own name, developing properties, managing investments, and gradually rebuilding the personal wealth that had been lost when Argent Corporation collapsed. He gave occasional media interviews about his extraordinary experiences, typically portraying himself as a fundamentally naive businessman who had been manipulated and threatened by organized crime figures beyond his control, who had cooperated reluctantly only after being severely intimidated, and who felt vindicated by the major prosecutions his testimony had enabled. This self-portrayal is certainly debatable and probably partially false. Glick was not truly an innocent victim. He had entered the arrangement with the Teamsters and mob figures entirely voluntarily, motivated primarily by personal ambition and the unprecedented opportunity to control major Las Vegas casinos. He understood from the very beginning that his partners were criminals, that the financing was fundamentally corrupt, that he was serving explicitly as a frontman for illegal operations. His eventual cooperation, while extraordinarily valuable to prosecutors, was motivated almost entirely by rational self-preservation rather than any sudden moral awakening or ethical epiphany. He chose testimony over prison and cooperation over loyalty, not because he suddenly recognized the mob as fundamentally evil, but because federal prosecutors had left him absolutely no other viable alternative. Nevertheless, Glick's testimony was consistently truthful and remarkably comprehensive. He did not fabricate evidence, did not exaggerate mob control, did not embellish threats for dramatic effect. His descriptions of the Skim operations mechanics, of Balistrieri's threats, of Rosenthal's actual authority were accurate and perfectly corroborated by independent evidence. Without his detailed testimony, prosecuting the bosses successfully would have been vastly more difficult, if not impossible. The convictions that destroyed 4 entire families depended substantially and directly on Glick's willingness to testify despite very real threats, and despite knowing with certainty that his reputation would be permanently and irreparably damaged. Allen Glick died on January 3, 2024, at age 81 in San Diego. His obituaries mentioned his ownership of Las Vegas casinos and his historic role as a witness in major organized crime trials, but focused primarily and more comfortably on his subsequent real estate career and his surviving family. He lived long enough to witness the complete and total destruction of the criminal organizations he had testified against. To see the comprehensive transformation of Las Vegas from a mob-controlled city to a corporate-controlled city, and to understand clearly that his testimony had contributed significantly to one of the most important victories in the FBI's decades-long war against organized crime in America. Frank Rosenthal's fate proved far more complex and ambiguous than Allen Glick's straightforward path to cooperation and redemption. Rosenthal never testified, never cooperated with authorities, never publicly admitted to any crimes whatsoever. He maintained consistently until his death that he was simply a highly skilled casino manager, that allegations of pervasive mob control were false or exaggerated, and that he had operated entirely within Nevada law despite admittedly lacking a formal gaming license. In 1976, Nevada gaming regulators had formally and permanently denied Rosenthal's application for a gaming license, citing his 1961 arrest for attempted bribery of college athletes and his extensive documented associations with known organized crime figures. Rosenthal appealed this denial through multiple levels of legal proceedings, arguing persistently that the 1961 case had not resulted in any conviction, that associations alone should not automatically disqualify someone from employment, and that he had clearly demonstrated exceptional competence in managing complex casino operations. His appeals were rejected decisively at every level. In 1981, the Nevada Supreme Court upheld the denial in a significant ruling, determining that gaming regulators possessed broad discretion to deny licenses based on legitimate character concerns and concerning associations. This definitive ruling forced Rosenthal to cease any official involvement whatsoever in Argent Corporation. He left Las Vegas in 1981, relocating to Florida where he would live for the remainder of his life. He continued sports betting professionally, remained extremely active in gambling circles, and maintained his hard-earned reputation as one of the most skilled handicappers in America. He hosted occasional gambling-themed radio shows and appeared on television programs discussing sports betting strategies and casino operations. On October 4, 1982, while Rosenthal was living in Florida and the major trials were actively ongoing, someone attempted to murder him with a sophisticated car bomb. Rosenthal entered his Cadillac Eldorado in the parking lot of a Tony Roma's restaurant in Miami. When he turned the ignition key, a powerful bomb planted beneath the vehicle detonated with devastating force. The explosion was powerful enough to completely destroy the car and would normally have been instantly fatal to any occupant. But Rosenthal miraculously survived, protected by a metal reinforcement plate that happened to be installed beneath the driver's seat as part of the vehicle's original design specifications. The plate deflected the explosion's force downward and outward rather than upward through the passenger compartment, saving his life, though causing very serious injuries that required extensive hospitalization. The bombing was never officially solved, and no arrests were ever made.
But law enforcement universally believed it was ordered by Chicago outfit figures who blamed Rosenthal for the skim operation's catastrophic exposure and believed he might eventually be pressured into cooperating with federal authorities despite his consistent refusals. The timing strongly supported this theory. The bombing occurred precisely while the major trials were ongoing, when mob bosses were absolutely desperate to prevent any additional witnesses from testifying and providing prosecutors with more evidence. Rosenthal's survival, despite the sophisticated and professionally executed assassination attempt, became an integral part of his legend, reinforcing his reputation as someone who simply could not be killed. Rosenthal never discussed the bombing in any detail publicly, never accused any specific individuals, never provided any information whatsoever to investigators, despite surely possessing strong suspicions about who had ordered his murder. He maintained absolute silence, adhering rigidly to street codes, even though he had never been formally inducted as a made member of La Cosa Nostra. This principled silence earned him grudging respect, even from law enforcement officials who had pursued him for years. Frank Rothstein lived quietly in Florida until his death on October 13, 2008, at age 79 from a heart attack. His extraordinary story became the basis for the character Sam Rothstein, portrayed by Robert De Niro in Martin Scorsese's acclaimed 1995 film Casino. The film takes significant dramatic liberties with actual events, but accurately depicts Rothstein's genuine brilliance as a casino operator, his complex relationships with Chicago mob figures, and his miraculous survival of the car bombing attempt. Rothstein's ultimate legacy is as a criminal genius who built a massive casino empire despite being legally barred from holding any gaming license, who generated millions in illegal profits for multiple mob families through sophisticated skimming operations, who survived professional assassination attempts and aggressive federal prosecution, and who never once betrayed his criminal partners despite having every conceivable incentive to cooperate and save himself. He was not a mobster in any traditional sense. He was never violent, never inducted into La Cosa Nostra, never someone who commanded soldiers or controlled territory through force. But he was absolutely essential to organized crime's greatest and most profitable gambling operation, and his extraordinary expertise transformed what could have been crude theft into a sophisticated financial enterprise that functioned smoothly for years. Frank Balistrieri's fate was perhaps the most tragic of the three central figures in this story. He was convicted in 1984, sentenced to 13 years in federal prison, and entered the federal correctional system at age 65. He had been Milwaukee's undisputed mob boss for more than 20 years, had operated with apparent complete impunity for decades, had accumulated very substantial wealth through numerous illegal and quasi-legal activities. Now he faced the genuine prospect of dying in prison, his criminal organization utterly destroyed, his sons also in prison. His lifetime of accumulated power and influence ended abruptly by testimony from a frontman he had believed he could control indefinitely through threats and intimidation. Balistrieri maintained his professed innocence throughout his imprisonment with remarkable consistency. He claimed repeatedly he was merely a legitimate businessman, that his nightclub operations and vending machine companies were entirely legal enterprises, that allegations of direct mob control over Las Vegas casinos were malicious fabrications by ambitious prosecutors seeking high-profile convictions for career advancement. This consistent denial was entirely characteristic of his entire criminal career. Balistrieri had always carefully presented himself publicly as a respectable businessman, despite absolutely overwhelming evidence of extensive criminal activities spanning decades. Prison proved extraordinarily difficult for Balistrieri personally. He was elderly, accustomed to complete deference and substantial luxury, utterly unprepared for the routine violence and severe deprivation of federal correctional facilities. He developed serious health problems, including heart disease and diabetes, that were inadequately treated in prison medical facilities with limited resources. He filed multiple appeals of his conviction through various legal channels, all of which were systematically rejected. He submitted numerous petitions for early compassionate release due to his rapidly declining health. These petitions were initially denied repeatedly. Finally, in 1989, after serving approximately 5 years of his sentence, Balistrieri was released to a halfway house due to his severely deteriorating health condition. Federal authorities concluded pragmatically that he no longer posed any meaningful threat to society. He was 70 years old, in extremely poor health, and his entire criminal organization had been comprehensively destroyed. He was required to remain in the halfway house under supervision and report regularly to probation officers, but he was no longer confined in a federal prison cell. Balistrieri returned to Milwaukee, but found a city utterly and completely changed from the one he had once dominated. The mob's influence had almost entirely disappeared. The social clubs where he had once held court and commanded respect were closed permanently or gentrified beyond recognition. The younger generation of Italian Americans demonstrated absolutely no interest in organized crime, strongly preferring legitimate careers in business, law, medicine, and other respectable professions. The corrupt relationships with union officials and cooperative political figures that had sustained Milwaukee's mob family for decades had been thoroughly exposed and systematically eliminated through subsequent prosecutions. Balistrieri attempted to resume some modest business activities, primarily offering consulting services for legitimate businesses, but his serious criminal conviction and notorious public reputation made him essentially unemployable in any significant capacity. He lived very modestly, supported primarily by family members and whatever limited wealth he had somehow managed to hide successfully from federal asset forfeiture proceedings. He watched helplessly as his sons were eventually released from prison and deliberately attempted to rebuild their disrupted lives far from Milwaukee, wanting absolutely nothing further to do with the criminal organization that had completely destroyed their father and their family name. Frank Balistrieri died on February 7, 1993 in Milwaukee at age 74. His funeral was attended by immediate family and a small number of very old associates, but it was absolutely not the grand ceremony with hundreds of mourners that might have occurred had he died in 1980 at the absolute height of his power and influence. Milwaukee's mob was by then essentially extinct as a functioning organization, reduced to a tiny handful of elderly men who occasionally met socially but controlled absolutely nothing. The family that Balistrieri had led for more than 2 decades ceased to exist as any coherent criminal organization within just a few years of his death. The casino skim prosecutions did not simply imprison individual mobsters as previous cases had done. They systematically destroyed entire organizational structures that had taken many decades to carefully build and maintain. The catastrophic impact on each family was permanent and irreversible. Kansas City's family, which had facilitated the crucial Teamsters loan that made the entire skim operation possible, which had coordinated complex distributions among 4 separate families, which had commanded genuine respect from even the powerful New York families, essentially ceased to exist as any significant criminal organization. By the middle 1990s, Kansas City was no longer even recognized as a major mafia family in FBI classifications. The few remaining elderly members operated only minor street-level rackets under constant, intensive federal surveillance. The family that had once controlled organized crime comprehensively throughout Missouri, Kansas, and substantial parts of Oklahoma was reduced to complete and permanent irrelevance. Chicago's outfit survived the devastating skim prosecutions but was permanently and severely weakened. Joseph Ayupa, John Cerrone, and Joseph Lombardo had represented the family's core leadership for 2 full decades. Their simultaneous imprisonment created an immediate succession crisis with no clear or accepted resolution. Multiple ambitious factions claimed authority and legitimacy. Internal conflicts led directly to numerous murders as ambitious capos attempted violently to seize power in the resulting vacuum.
The FBI skillfully exploited this organizational chaos, aggressively recruiting well-placed informants, conducting wave after wave of additional prosecutions, and systematically dismantling what still remained of Chicago's once utterly dominant criminal organization. By the early 2000s, Chicago retained perhaps 100 MAID members and several hundred associates, merely a small fraction of its immense strength and influence in the 1970s. The families still operated some gambling, loan sharking, and limited labor racketeering, but the era when Chicago commanded automatic respect and wielded genuine influence nationally was definitively and permanently over. Milwaukee's small family was utterly and completely destroyed by Frank Balistrieri's conviction and the simultaneous imprisonment of his sons. The organization never recovered, even partially, from losing its boss and his two primary successors simultaneously in one devastating blow. Milwaukee had always been relatively small, perpetually dependent on Chicago's patronage and permission, strictly limited to operating only within Wisconsin's borders. Without any effective leadership, and without the substantial skim revenue that had represented a very significant portion of the family's total annual income, Milwaukee simply could not sustain itself as a viable criminal organization. By the mid-1990s, the Milwaukee Mafia family existed only in FBI historical records as an extinct entity. No functioning criminal organization whatsoever remained. Cleveland's family was obliterated by the devastating combination of the Skim prosecutions and Angelo Leonardo's unprecedented decision to cooperate comprehensively as a government witness. Leonardo's extraordinarily detailed testimony provided federal prosecutors with unprecedented insight into the family's internal structure and extensive criminal operations, leading directly to numerous additional indictments and convictions that went far beyond the original Skim cases.
Cleveland's mob, which had once controlled gambling and labor racketeering throughout all of northern Ohio, was reduced to a tiny remnant that could not operate even marginally effectively under the resulting intense and continuous federal scrutiny. By the early 2000s, Cleveland was essentially extinct as any recognizable mafia family. The total cumulative destruction was absolutely staggering in its scope and permanence. 4 families that had collectively commanded many hundreds of MAID members and literally thousands of associates throughout the 1970s were reduced to pathetic fragments or eliminated entirely by the mid-1990s. The powerful bosses who had received millions in illegal skim proceeds died in prison or shortly after release, never recovering their positions. The soldiers and associates who had depended completely on family protection for their livelihoods were left desperately vulnerable, with many becoming informants themselves to avoid prosecution. The organizational structures that had governed these families effectively for multiple generations were shattered utterly and irreparably beyond any possibility of reconstruction. The casino skim prosecutions were uniquely and unprecedentedly devastating compared to other major RICO cases in the 1980s and 90s. Several critical factors explain this exceptional impact that went far beyond typical organized crime prosecutions. First, and most importantly, the skim cases simultaneously targeted 4 separate families rather than focusing on just one organization as most previous prosecutions had done. This extraordinary coordination created devastating cascading effects as each family's destruction progressively weakened all the others.
Second, the prosecution systematically eliminated both bosses and underbosses simultaneously in each family, completely decapitating leadership rather than leaving any continuity. When a boss is imprisoned but his underboss remains free and functional, organizational continuity remains possible and succession can occur smoothly. But the skim cases imprisoned both critical levels of leadership in each family simultaneously, creating catastrophic succession vacuums that ambitious but often incompetent members attempted to fill through violence and chaos rather than negotiation and tradition. Third, the skim represented each family's single most profitable criminal operation by a substantial margin. The millions generated annually from Las Vegas were not merely supplementary income, but rather the essential financial foundation supporting these entire organizations. When the skim abruptly ended, families lost revenue streams they absolutely could not replace through traditional street rackets like gambling, loan sharking, or labor extortion. Without adequate money, they could not pay soldiers, could not bribe officials, could not fund any new criminal ventures. Financial collapse preceded and dramatically accelerated organizational collapse. Fourth, Allen Glick's highly visible cooperation established a deeply troubling precedent that frontmen and professional associates were absolutely not bound by omerta and would testify comprehensively if sufficiently pressured by federal authorities. This realization genuinely terrified mob bosses who had relied increasingly on professionals, including accountants, lawyers, and casino managers, to handle complex financial operations that required expertise beyond what typical street criminals possessed. If these sophisticated professionals could be systematically turned into witnesses, if they would testify comprehensively about organizational structures and detailed criminal activities, then sophisticated operations like the casino skim were essentially impossible to sustain long-term. The mob could no longer operate at that level of financial and organizational complexity without simultaneously creating fatal vulnerabilities to federal prosecution. Fifth, the extraordinary publicity surrounding the trials and convictions severely damaged the mafia's essential mystique and aura of invincibility. For many decades, organized crime had maintained substantial power partly through carefully cultivated reputation. The widespread belief that the mafia was essentially untouchable, that powerful bosses could never be successfully prosecuted, that omerta would absolutely protect members from betrayal. The skim prosecutions demonstrated conclusively and publicly that bosses could definitely be convicted, that complex operations could be completely exposed, that witnesses would testify despite threats and tradition. This severely damaged the fear and respect that had sustained mob power for generations, making it progressively harder to recruit promising new members, harder to intimidate victims effectively, harder to maintain control over traditional territories. Sixth, Nevada gaming regulators used the shocking prosecutions as comprehensive justification for implementing far stricter oversight of casino ownership and operations. The public revelation that mob figures had controlled major legitimate casinos for years through frontmen deeply embarrassed regulators and seriously threatened Nevada's hard-won reputation as a jurisdiction with genuinely legitimate gaming regulation and oversight. Post-skim licensing investigations became dramatically more thorough, background checks far more comprehensive, ownership structures much more transparent. The mob could no longer control casinos through simple frontman arrangements, completely eliminating their single most profitable operation and forcing them back exclusively to traditional street rackets that generated far less revenue and offered much less opportunity for growth. The financial impact of the skim operation and its catastrophic destruction can be quantified with reasonable accuracy based on trial testimony, seized financial records, and detailed FBI estimates. The total amount systematically skimmed from the Stardust and Fremont between 1975 and 1979 was approximately $14 to $15 million. This represented roughly $2.8 to $3 million annually distributed among 4 families according to carefully negotiated percentages. Kansas City received approximately 40% of total skim proceeds, roughly $5.6 million over the operation's entire duration, or approximately $1.1 to $1.2 million annually. This represented a very substantial portion of the Kansas City family's total annual income, possibly 30 to 40% of all revenues. Chicago took roughly 30%, approximately $4.2 to $4.5 million total, or roughly $840,000 to $900,000 annually. For Chicago, this was less significant as a percentage of total income, since the outfit generated tens of millions annually from diverse operations, but it still represented substantial and important revenue. Milwaukee received between 15 and 20%, approximately $2.1 to $3 million total, or roughly $420 to $600,000 annually. For Milwaukee's much smaller family, this represented a significantly larger percentage of total income, possibly 40 to 50% of all revenues. Cleveland's share was approximately 10 to 15%, $1.4 to $2.25 million total, or roughly $280 to $450,000 annually. Again, for a smaller family, this was a very significant and important revenue stream. Legal costs of defending against the comprehensive skim prosecutions were enormous and devastating. Each family spent millions on legal representation for multiple defendants. Frank Balistrieri's defense alone likely cost several $100,000. Collectively, the four families probably spent $5 to $10 million on legal fees, money that came from organizations already severely weakened by the complete loss of skim revenue. Federal authorities seized extensive properties, businesses, and funds directly connected to convicted defendants through aggressive asset forfeiture proceedings. While exact totals are difficult to determine precisely, asset forfeiture likely reached several million additional dollars, further catastrophically depleting families' already diminished resources. The lost future revenue represents perhaps the most significant long-term financial impact.
The skim generated approximately $3 million annually and could theoretically have continued indefinitely if not exposed and destroyed. Over just the decade from 1980 to 1990, had the operation somehow continued undetected, it would have generated approximately $30 million in untaxed profits. This massive lost future revenue represents the enormous opportunity cost of the operation's exposure, money the families would certainly have earned had Allen Glick not chosen cooperation over loyalty and silence. The casino skim operation contains profound and bitter irony that makes it particularly significant in organized crime history. The mob achieved something genuinely extraordinary and unprecedented, gaining effective control of legitimate licensed casinos and extracting millions in completely unreported profits over multiple years. This represented the absolute culmination of organized crime's long evolution from crude street thugs to sophisticated businessmen operating complex financial enterprises. The scheme was not particularly violent. No one was murdered specifically to facilitate it. It was not crude or obvious. It required genuine financial expertise and systematic coordination across multiple cities and organizations. It demonstrated conclusively that the Mafia could operate at levels of sophistication and complexity rivaling major legitimate corporations. Yet this very sophistication and complexity created the specific vulnerabilities that ultimately destroyed the entire operation. The skim absolutely required trusting Allen Glick, who was crucially not a made member, who had taken no blood oath binding him to eternal silence, who would inevitably calculate self-interest rationally when federal prosecutors credibly threatened him with decades in federal prison. It required maintaining detailed financial records that became devastating evidence when seized by investigators. It required continuous coordination among multiple families, necessitating regular communications that were systematically intercepted through FBI wiretaps. Every single element that made the skim sophisticated and successful also made it critically vulnerable to prosecution when one crucial participant decided that cooperation was clearly preferable to imprisonment. The mob's greatest success became directly and inevitably their greatest failure. The operation that generated millions and demonstrated impressive organizational sophistication also produced the comprehensive evidence that destroyed 4 entire families. The frontman who made the operation possible, who held the essential licenses that allowed mob control of major casinos, became the star witness whose detailed testimony sent powerful bosses to prison for decades. Frank Balistrieri clearly understood this terrible irony during his final years. He spent considerable time reflecting bitterly on how a young real estate developer from San Diego, someone Balistrieri had viewed as fundamentally weak and easily controllable, had completely destroyed his organization through just a few days of detailed testimony in federal court.
Balistrieri had explicitly threatened Glick in March of 1978, had absolutely believed that intimidation alone would ensure permanent compliance, had never seriously imagined that Glick would ultimately betray the entire arrangement. This fundamental miscalculation, believing that fear alone could somehow secure absolute loyalty from someone who was never truly part of La Cosa Nostra and bound by its codes, cost Balistrieri absolutely everything: his freedom, his criminal organization, his accumulated wealth, his personal legacy. Allen Glick lived with different but equally significant ironies. He became wealthy through deliberate participation in criminal conspiracy, lost it all through federal prosecution, then methodically rebuilt his fortune through entirely legitimate business practices. He was simultaneously victim and perpetrator, arguably coerced into cooperation with mob figures, but also voluntarily entering an arrangement he clearly understood was fundamentally criminal from the beginning. He was publicly celebrated as a crucial cooperating witness whose testimony brought down major crime families, yet remained privately notorious as a willing frontman who had personally profited substantially from organized crime before being caught. His testimony destroyed 4 families and helped end the mob's control of Las Vegas, yet he expressed surprisingly little satisfaction or sense of moral victory. He understood clearly that his cooperation was motivated almost entirely by rational self-preservation rather than any sense of justice or civic duty, that he was primarily saving himself rather than fighting crime or protecting society. Frank Rosenthal embodied perhaps the greatest and most poignant irony of all.
He was a genuine criminal genius who built an impressive casino empire he could never legally own, who survived professional assassination attempts and aggressive federal prosecution, who remained absolutely loyal to men who had tried to kill him, who never achieved the recognition and respect his extraordinary abilities truly deserved because his success was illegal and his loyalty was to criminals. Rosenthal died respected in specialized gambling circles, but essentially unknown to the general public. His genuine brilliance was completely overshadowed by his criminal associations, his impressive achievements permanently erased by their illegal context. The Stardust Hotel and Casino, where millions of dollars were systematically skimmed from count rooms before official recording, where Frank Rosenthal built his criminal empire through analytical genius, where Allen Glick learned the hard lesson that owning casinos on paper means absolutely nothing when other more powerful people control them in reality, was finally imploded on March 13, 2007. The deliberate demolition took merely 90 seconds to erase more than 4 decades of complex history. The mob years, the corporate years, the slow decline into irrelevance, all collapsed into dust and rubble. The iconic building that represented organized crime's greatest gambling achievement simply ceased to exist, replaced by empty land that remains undeveloped today. The money the mob systematically stole, approximately $14 million in completely unreported cash, temporarily enriched bosses who used it to fund their criminal operations, corrupt officials, and maintain their power structures. When those bosses were imprisoned and their organizations collapsed utterly, the money simply vanished into the vast underground economy, spent and dispersed beyond any possibility of recovery. The families that money sustained are now extinct or utterly irrelevant. The couriers who transported it are dead. The count room employees who facilitated it have moved on to other lives. The entire elaborate infrastructure dissolved completely, replaced by corporate ownership and strict regulatory oversight that makes systematic large-scale skimming virtually impossible. What remains today is primarily a historical lesson about criminal sophistication and its inherent limitations, about frontmen who cannot be reliably controlled through threats alone, About criminal organizations that believed their power was permanent and unassailable until a single witness testified and everything collapsed simultaneously. Allen Glick made a fateful choice in January of 1979. He could testify and destroy the entire operation or remain silent and spend decades in federal prison. He chose testimony. 4 major mafia families paid the ultimate price for trusting a frontman who valued his personal freedom more than their criminal empire. The skim was supposed to last indefinitely, generating millions annually forever. It lasted barely 4 years. The families were supposed to be untouchable, protected by fear and omerta. They were systematically destroyed. The bosses were supposed to die free, wealthy, and powerful. They died in prison cells, stripped of everything. And Allen Glick, the expendable frontman who was supposed to remain silent and compliant, testified for days in multiple trials, sent dozens of mobsters to prison for decades, and lived to age 81, dying peacefully in San Diego, having outlived everyone who had ever threatened him. The empire built on invisible money collapsed completely because the man who made it invisible decided that testimony in court and cooperation with prosecutors were ultimately more powerful than loyalty, more dangerous than guns, and more permanent than blood oaths. The casino skim was the mob's greatest financial achievement. Allen Glick's testimony was their greatest defeat. And the lesson echoes clearly across the decades. Empires built by trusting those who have no absolute loyalty will inevitably be destroyed by those same people when self-interest demands it. The frontman betrayed the bosses. The bosses died in prison. The empire vanished into history. And Las Vegas became a city where corporations, not criminals, control the casinos. And money flows through official channels, counted and taxed and transparent. The age of invisible money ended because one man chose visibility. The age of mob control ended because one witness testified. The age of criminal empires ended because one frontman decided that freedom was worth more than loyalty. It took 4 years to build. It took one testimony to destroy. And nothing remains except history, court records, and empty land where the Stardust once stood. A quiet monument to an empire that believed it would last forever and vanished in a courtroom.